One of the big legislative battles that progressives are gearing up for right now is an effort to raise the federal minimum wage. The Raise the Wage Act is calling for the federal minimum wage for all workers to be raised to $15 an hour gradually over the next 5 years. Currently, it's $7.25 an hour. Well, one of the people who has been working in this area for many, many years is Saru Jayaraman, who is the president and the co-founder of One Fair Wage. She joins us right now for Free Speech TV's weekly Facebook Live. Thank you so much for being with us. $7.25 an hour, that is right now the federal minimum wage.
That's right. And even worse, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which the restaurant industry is actually the largest employer of minimum wage workers in the United States. And a majority of restaurant workers are tipped, and they can be paid a federal minimum wage of $2.13 an hour. So the minimum wage, federal minimum wage for non-tipped workers is currently $7.25. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers is still $2.13 an hour. And the Raise the Wage Act that's currently being considered in Congress would raise that wage for all workers, tipped and non-tipped, to $15 an hour over time. So it would raise the overall wage from $7.25 to $15, and it would fully phase out any sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It also phases out a sub-minimum wage for workers with disabilities and youth. So it is truly historic, not just in raising the minimum wage, but ending the sub-minimum wage, which is a literal legacy of slavery, actually, in the United States.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because it does seem to be a uniquely American thing that there are some workers who, instead of being paid by their employers, are being paid by customers in the form of tips. It seems quite American, and has links to slavery, but it started, I believe, in Britain. But take us through how we have gotten to this position where there are workers who are essentially at the whim of customers, whether or not they're going to get paid.
That's right. Tipping did originate in feudal Europe. It was something that aristocrats and nobles gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage as an extra or a bonus, noblesse oblige, for a job well done. A gift in a holiday, or for a special occasion. When that idea came to the States, it actually came right before emancipation of slaves, the end of slavery. And at emancipation, the restaurant owners wanted the ability to hire Black workers and continue to not pay them. And so they mutated the notion of tipping from being an extra or bonus or a gift on top of a wage, as it was in Europe, to becoming the wage itself. Now, in the United States, prior to emancipation, there was actually a populist movement rejecting the notion of tipping as a vestige of feudalism. There was a rallying cry: "We're a democracy. We don't tip here. Employers should pay their workers, not customers, and you should get good service regardless of what you can afford to tip." And that populist movement spread to Europe, and actually the labor movement picked it up in Europe, and tipping. They really got rid of tipping in much of Europe for a long time, based on the rallying cry that we're professionals, we don't live off of your largesse. We want to get rid of this feudal notion. But in the United States, we went in the exact opposite direction, really growing tipping as a replacement for wages, which, as I said, is a mutation of the original concept. And that idea that a mostly Black and actually mostly female workforce could, get paid exclusively in tips was made law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when all workers in the US got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time, except for millions of Black workers, farm workers, domestic workers, and tipped restaurant workers were told you get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. So we went from zero in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour today. And it's important to understand this $2 wage is not for a tiny sliver of workers. This is the nation's second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer. It was almost 14 million workers before the pandemic. So you're talking about almost 1 in 10 Americans working in this industry. And if they get tips, they can be paid legally as little as $2. And you're right, it is uniquely American. It's a uniquely American, frankly, legacy of a very ugly history of wanting to profit off the value of Black labor without paying for it. That's where this idea of a sub-minimum wage comes from.
Well, let's talk more about those. Well, as you said, before the pandemic, almost 14 million workers, the vast majority are women. And yet there seems to be a popular narrative that's put forward when we talk about raising wages for tipped workers. And that is, these are college kids, these are high school students, it's just a bit of pocket money for them. We can't have them in the same category as other minimum wage workers. Tell us the reality of who restaurant workers are, because this is an area you've been working on for years, been really since after 9/11, and taking a look at who restaurant workers are and the situations that they're working through.
Absolutely. So first of all, it's important to note that those 14 million workers are the lowest paid workers in America. Every year, the US Department of Labor has put out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs. Every year, 7 of the 10 lowest paying occupations are all in the restaurant industry. And 4 of the 7 lowest paid occupations in the US are tipped occupations. So you're talking about a huge industry with the lowest paying jobs, the largest employer of minimum wage workers. And among tipped workers in particular, 70% are women, as you said. They're largely women who work in casual restaurants, IHOPs, Denny's, Applebee's, Olive Gardens, casual mom and pops, making very little money in tips. They use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce. They suffer from poverty rates that are 3 times the rate of the rest of the US workforce. Their median age is 35, which means they're not actually mostly teenagers. If the median age is 35, that means half of the workers are above 35. And more, and more like 60% or more are above the age of 24. So these are mostly adults. About a third have children. You've got a huge population of single mothers in this group, struggling to make ends meet on sub-minimum wages and tips, and also struggling with the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the US, because they have to tolerate all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. The fact that they are single mothers makes them very vulnerable to have to tolerate all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior. They have to put up with whatever the customer does to them, however they touch them or treat them or talk to them, because they know that they have to tolerate it in order to get tips to feed their kids, to go home and feed their children on tips. And we know that the sexual harassment is directly correlated to the sub-minimum wage, because there are 7 states that got rid of this system many decades ago. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. Not only do these 7 states actually have higher restaurant sales per capita, higher job growth in the restaurant industry, higher small business growth. Small business restaurants grow faster in states with a full minimum wage with tips on top. But these 7 states also have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, because in those states, women are able to rely on a wage from their boss. They're not as completely dependent on the tips from the customers. They don't feel like they have to put up with everything and anything from customers to feed their kids, because they can count on a wage from their boss like every other worker in every other industry.
Well, let's talk about the impact of COVID-19, because, of course, the restaurant industry has been decimated by the pandemic, as have so many other sectors. And yet frontline workers tend to be those minimum wage workers, whether they're in grocery stores or restaurants. And in fact, those industries have been deemed the most dangerous occupations to have during the pandemic. So put that into context.
So first, it's important to note that these workers, everything I've been describing with pre-pandemic conditions, I call it a pre-existing condition that existed prior to the pandemic that got just exacerbated and blown up during the pandemic. So first of all, 60% of restaurant workers lost their jobs during the pandemic. That's 1 in 4 unemployed people were in the restaurant industry. And 60% of that huge number, 60, could not get unemployment insurance because they were told in most states that their sub-minimum wage of $2, $3, or $4 an hour. Keep in mind, the wage for tipped workers is $5 or less in 4 out of 5 states. 40 states in the US have a wage of $5 or less. So in these 40 states, workers were told your wages are too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for unemployment insurance. So they were left with no income, no way to feed their children, and forced in the millions to go back to work before they felt safe. And when they did go back to work, they were faced with very dangerous conditions. As you mentioned, actually, both the CDC And now University of California, San Francisco, one of the top medical schools in the country, have named restaurants the most dangerous place to work because they are consistently on every shift interacting with customers who don't have masks on while they eat and drink. And our workers reported that they're being asked to do more for less. They're asked to enforce now social distancing and mask rules when tips are down 50 to 75%, and the workers are saying, you're asking me to enforce these rules on the same customers who I need tips from to make up my base wages. It's an impossible situation, and I can't enforce these rules, which is a public health disaster, not just for those workers, but for all of us. Because if the CDC has named the restaurant industry the most dangerous place for customers to be, we rely on these workers to enforce these rules to prevent future outbreaks. But they can't, as long as they need tips from those same customers. I think what was most outrageous from the research we did was that we found that 40% of workers said sexual harassment, which was already the highest in our industry of any industry, went way up during the pandemic. And hundreds of women reported that they were asked by male customers to take off their masks so male customers could judge their looks and therefore their tips on that basis. Just an outrageous and horrific, life-threatening situation in which millions of women are essentially being asked to expose themselves to the virus for the chance to get a tip, to be judged for a chance to get a tip, making these the only essential workers not getting the minimum wage and the only essential workers being asked to remove their protective gear for a chance to earn their income. And honestly, for anybody who has ever asked, why is $15 part of this COVID package? What does it have to do with COVID? I know certain senators have been saying this is not a COVID issue. This is so clearly a COVID issue when millions of women are being paid $2 and $3 and $4 an hour and feel compelled to take off their mask for the chance to get tips because they're paid so little that they rely on those tips to feed their kids.
Well, just as we finish up, Saru, in addition to the Raise the Wage Act, there are changes at the Department of Labour, and Biden's nominee for Secretary of Labour, when he was mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, himself advocated for $15 an hour minimum wage, but he also acknowledged the gendered nature of those minimum wage workers. Do you have faith that we're going to see change right now?
I do. I really believe the minimum wage is going to go up this year and that Congress has this historic opportunity to end this legacy of slavery. I think the question will be, how high do we raise the wage? And does Congress not just raise the wage for tipped workers, but get rid of this minimum wage altogether? Look, I think it's important for people to remember that the last time we faced unemployment at this scale was the Great Depression. We are facing Great Depression levels of unemployment. And at that moment, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, and Congress knew that the way that the economy was going to recover was the New Deal, which not only included relief, it included the first federal minimum wage. And because they understood that the economy could not recover without raising workers' wages. But in that New Deal, they left out so many millions of Black workers intentionally, including tipped workers. And so now we have an opportunity for a New Deal now that will help our economy recover. I do believe there's enough understanding that we have to raise wages for this economy to recover. For small businesses who are so worried about small businesses, there's no way for them to last unless people in their neighborhoods, in their communities can afford to eat out, can afford to consume in small businesses. So we need this for small business. We need this for these workers. We need this for our families. We need this for our country. The question is, will we right the wrongs of the last New Deal and end this historic legacy of slavery? Not just raise the wage, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, for workers with disabilities, for youth. It's time for a new Deal.
And how can viewers best get involved in this issue, engage with it, and advance this legislation?
Thanks for asking. You can go to our website, One Fair Wage, ONE, Fair Wage, FAIR wage.org, ONE, fairwage.org, onefairwage.org, and click the blue button to send a letter to your legislator. You just put in your zip code and your name, and it will send a letter to your Congress member saying, you've got to raise the wage now, pass the Raise the Wage Act in its entirety, raise the wage to 15, and let's get rid of these sub-minimum wages for tipped workers, workers with disabilities, and youth.
Well, Saru, thank you so much for being with us, and letting us know what's happening at the federal level around raising the minimum wage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And join us next Wednesday for another Facebook Live session. Same time, same place, right here, Free Speech TV. Let us know your thoughts on these issues. We'd love for you to engage with us on social media. Thank you so much for joining us.